Good evening. I'm Dr. Brian Henning. I'm professor of philosophy and environmental studies at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, where I'm the director of the Gonzaga Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. I'm honored to host tonight's event along with the Gonzaga Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences. At the beginning, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, recognizing in the spirit of the Jesuit composition of practice of the composition of place, we acknowledge that Gonzaga University resides on the homelands of the Spokane tribal people, the people of the river. It's their ancestors who are here and bring forth the power of this place, the knowledge that comes from the land. We're grateful to be on this land and ask for its support as we work to manifest our intentions during this gathering of hearts and minds. The event this evening is hosted by the Gonzaga Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. Informed by an abiding commitment to a just society and care for the planet, the Gonzaga Climate Center was created to serve our campus in the Inland Northwest by promoting innovative interdisciplinary scholarship, teaching, consulting, and capacity building. Hosting events such as this is an example of that mission at work. Bit of housekeeping, you'll note that the closed captioning is made available on the event this evening. You can turn it on and off at your pleasure. At the bottom of your screen, you should be able to toggle those captions on and off. They're auto-generated, notice, so that sometimes the system does a good job and sometimes not so much. The chat feature is largely disabled. You can send notes to me and to our panelists, but if you'd like to post questions, I would encourage you to go to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and you can open that now, and you're able to pose questions during the talk or during the Q&A period, and other participants can vote questions up or down. That helps us select which questions we might pose to our speaker this evening. Finally, please note that our event is being recorded, and it will be posted to the Climate Center's YouTube channel soon, hopefully tomorrow. And you can find there a considerable library of past events that we've hosted, again, on our YouTube channel. And finally, before introducing our speaker, I wanted to bring attention to the fact that we also have a wonderful event coming up, one more event coming up this semester that you can register for by going to gonzaga.edu/climate-center-events. Dr. John Abatsoglu from UC Merced will be talking about the credibility of climate models on November 15th, our last event for this semester before we launch into our spring list, which will be announced very soon. So please consider going to www.gonzaga.edu/climate-center-events and register for that free event that we'll be hosting. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Sarah J. Jaquette is chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt in Arcata, California, on Wayat territory. Ray's first book, The Ecological Other, Environmental Exclusion in American Culture, explored the phenomenon of green hate in US history and its legacy of ableism, xenophobia, and ecofascism in mainstream ecological thought. Dr. Ray's current work is motivated by the despair she felt she started observing in her students about a decade ago, focusing on the role of emotions in climate justice advocacy. Ray's recent work explores the interplay between inner resilience and collective action. Her book on this topic, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet, is intended to serve as an existential toolkit for the climate generation. Ray's writing on emotions and climate justice activism has been published in numerous venues, including the LA Times and Scientific American. She consults extensively on the topic of climate anxiety and is working on an edited book called An Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators. She offers a professional development workshop to help center emotions in climate work called the Climate Wisdom Lab, and has begun teaching a mindfulness course on transforming climate anxiety. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ray to discuss the emotional life of the climate justice movement.
Thanks so much, Dr. Henning, and thanks so much to the Gonzaga Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment for sponsoring this event and the series. And I'm just honored to join you all tonight to talk about this topic, and I'm thrilled that you all are eager to hear about it, and I can't wait for your Q&A at the end and discussion at the end. So just as a little bit of context before I get started, the book that I ended up publishing, The Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, emerged out of a sense that climate education, as I understood it from my PhD, was really going down the wrong path. And I didn't really realize this until my students started to react to the content in their classes, including in my own classes that were mostly focused on environmental justice. And so they were getting the science from their sciences, the bad economic stuff from their economics classes, all their classes, no matter what discipline they were taking these wide variety of classes in, all they were hearing about was how bad stuff was, how humanity was doing all these terrible things to the environment. And it was really causing them to go into sort of a spiral of despair. And it dawned on me that I had initially thought that my role as an educator, or at least what I had gotten the memo from my PhD, was to scare them to get them to care, or scared to care pedagogy, as I like to call it. And I thought that was the job of an educator, especially in an environmental field. And I also wanted to challenge their cherished beliefs that they had grown up thinking about what nature is or what wilderness is, and really shake them up about questions of justice and how justice play into environmental concerns. And there was really a sense of arming them with as good arguments as they could possibly have so they could go out into the world and persuade more people to care and get more people kind of on board with environmental justice ideas. And it turned out that that particular set of assumptions that I was making about what my role was as an educator, I didn't really even explore them or wasn't even aware of them until I started to see my students fall apart in classes. And I had to examine those assumptions, become aware of what I was coming into my classes with, and think about what was maybe the emotional hidden curriculum of our syllabi, of our classes, and of our content. And it raised a question for me: what are the emotional outcomes or the existential outcomes or goals that we might have for this generation that we're not really considering in climate education? And as I dove into that research, I realized how critical that question was, and I hope to synthesize some of that research for you today. So I'm going to start with slideshow. The beginning, what I want to start with is just a little bit of an introduction into the shallow end of the pond, shallow end of the pool, about how it is that I came to this topic and what I think of climate anxiety as sort of a definition of it. And so just a little bit of an exposure to how pervasive this term has become. Since 2019, the term has become kind of a word of the year in GRIST and OED. And the terms eco-grief, climate anxiety, and a few others have become pretty common and kind of a catch-all term to refer to a lot of different emotions, for better or for worse, which we can get to in the Q&A for sure. And so just some places where this has come up, it's come up for sure in conversations about the mental health impacts of climate change on us and on different populations and communities of people, whether how close they are to the front line versus all the way to the most insulated, privileged people who are thinking about it maybe in the more abstract future kind of ways. So this conversation is really about mental health. This is about adding climate change onto a long other list of other mental health problems and thinking about how it is, for example, in Leslie Davenport's book, we might bring in climate anxiety and climate emotions into therapeutic situations and providing mental health services. The conversation is also taken up by Glenn Albrecht and philosophers and folks who are thinking about language and the role that we have in the role that language has in helping us articulate, see, and thereby maybe do something about politically the human relationship to the natural world. And so you have folks like Glenn Albrecht coming up with new words to try to describe the effects of climate change on humans. For example, you might be familiar with the concept of solastalgia. That's a term that Glenn Albrecht came up with, and he also has many other emotion states. And he, in fact, doesn't even like the term climate anxiety, but we can also get to that in Q&A. So he's really paying attention to how do we put words on things that otherwise we don't see. And so the words themselves, the emotional granularity, so to speak, around how humans are experiencing environmental change needs to be really granular and detailed so that we can do something about it. You might see sort of, I'm going to give a few images now that are sort of popular culture versions of this. This is Chris Jordan. And if you didn't see his documentary film Midway about the albatross, or the photographs that he took of albatross that were dead, the skeletons with the plastics all on their stomachs, where he really realized that something so far away from his regular daily activity and in a Midway atoll would be an effect of climate change, and the sort of the damage that is happening so far away was a way for him to really bring climate change home. And after he filmed that, made that film, he dove into a pit of depression and anxiety and despair over the climate. And so his story became a little bit of a clarion for climate anxiety. Similarly, Josh Fox's film, if you've seen that one, I'm sort of giving you these popular culture examples to say climate anxiety has kind of made it into pop culture too. So it's not completely a foreign concept to folks. This is really, I think, an emotional journey through how it is that one person, Josh Fox himself, can navigate through the emotional roller coaster of coming to terms with what's going on with climate change. And if you're not familiar with Big Little Lies, this was an episode entirely devoted to climate anxiety, where the 8-year-old daughter of a very, very wealthy family starts fainting in classes where she's learning about sustainability and polar bears and ice caps, and she gets diagnosed in the actual hospital in a medical model, right? The icon of the medical model with climate anxiety. And you might be familiar with the past few years has been 2 notable self-immolations. This is when Bruce, who doused himself in gasoline and lit himself on fire on Earth Day this year. And there have been a couple of those that are trying to bring attention to this being symbolic for what humanity is doing to itself through fossil fuel use and trying to raise attention. So we see in these examples, questions of mental health, questions of despair and anxiety coming up in lots of different stories and ways. In particular, in my research, I focus a lot in terms of what this phenomenon is doing, what kind of work it's doing with young people, because college students are the people who brought this to my attention and made me want to try to do something about it. And I really believe that the younger people are, the longer they're going to be on the planet, and therefore the more investment in their tools I feel needs to happen. And this particular study in 2021 was it came as a really big splash into the field of this topic of study. And these are some colleagues of mine and some other people whose work I know: Caroline Hickman, Panu Pika, Jennifer Nchendu, a bunch of other folks who put together a study of over 10,000 young people ages 16 to 25 in spring of 2021, and came up with the first time ever, some large scale data on how prevalent climate anxiety is in youth. And for this particular group, what they're interested in is how these emotions might be leveraged for political change in human rights law to demonstrate moral injury. And so I think this is fascinating, because we often think about emotions as something private, that's something that's happening on an individual basis that you deal with in your therapist's room or with your family or your intimate loved ones or your friends. But what I really want to do throughout the course of this talk is to bring emotions much more center to our political conversation and to the political context. And this is a study that really explicitly tries to do that. And just to sort of push this beyond the boundaries of these kind of stories of white male protagonists going through their journey of climate anxiety, a recent study by Charles Ogumbote and many others, who looked at 32 countries and the prevalence of climate anxiety in all of these different places. And he's really interested. Charles Ogumbote is very interested in his research on diversifying the conversation around climate anxiety, because the vast majority of studies on this are really with fairly privileged and mostly white populations. And so is my colleague Jade Sasser, who I'll talk a little bit about all of this research too. And if you aren't familiar with Don't Look Up, the film that came out last year, that was really a story of climate anxiety and this kind of what happens when there's a metaphorical or real asteroid coming towards your planet, and it's going to hit for sure. The scientific certainty is in on this. And how do you get people to actually mobilize and care about it enough? Does climate anxiety even work to mobilize people to avert the threat, is really the question I feel that that film really raised for me. So just a little stepping our toes into the shallow end of the pond. I'm going to give a list now of kind of things that my students presented in the classroom over the few years that I was starting to think, maybe I need to research this if I'm going to really rise to this moment that the students are demanding of educators right now. And by way of sort of walking you through my students' experiences and a lot of these emotions, not all of them felt them at all the time, but this was kind of a collection of ways that they presented that dominated in our conversations. And I hope that this sort of puts together a picture of what I am thinking of as climate anxiety when I wrote my book. So first of all, they often feel that there is no good that they can do for the planet, only something understood as impact. And the way that most environmental sciences and climate education teaches young people about the relationship between humans and the natural world is this negative impact stuff. And there is not a lot of evidence that humans or any community of humans is ever a positive impact on the environment, really only a negative impact on the environment. And they see something like the ecological footprint exercise that they often do in environmental science classes, even as young as in high school. And they get this overwhelming sense of pervasive complicity in all of these problems and culpability laid on their shoulders. And they cannot see through any possibility that they can do anything good in the scale, at the scale of the problem. Relatedly, they have this notion that all of humanity sucks. And Karen Lifton calls this the misanthropic temptation. And the misanthropic temptation is the sort of breeding ground for attitudes like ecofascism and the extreme kind of taking up of climate anxiety into arenas of mass violence, as we saw in Buffalo with the notion of the Great Replacement theory, and of course in El Paso and Christchurch. These are certainly not fringe or extreme cases of climate anxiety using the misanthropic temptation to decide that certain communities are in fact the problem, and the climate anxiety kind of putting people beyond the place of self-regulation and doing violent actions. So this notion of all of humanity sucks really is maybe innocent, but it certainly is prevalent in so much climate education when we talk about the framework of human impact or human relationship with the natural world, without specifying and being nuanced about which populations of humans are doing what and whether or not any populations of humans are in fact good for the environment, and etc. But this is probably the biggest thing that I hear from people, and whenever I have just even the 10-minute conversation with folks, this is the question that most people want to talk about. The problems feel too big and interconnected. Climate change is presented as this really, really big issue, a global in scale, and touching ecosystems far, far away from it where humans have ever been. This feeling of the scale and size of it just feels completely untouchable and uninfluenceable. So people individually feel too small and powerless to fix them. And I want to, this particular problem I'm going to really dive into in the talk today. Students feel that they're past the point of no return, that humanity is inevitably, doomed to experience all of the models that are in the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this also has been referred to in a lot of debates about climate anxiety as doomism. And so I'll shorthand talk about doomism this way, this kind of inevitability trope that happens in so much climate discourse. I even was just on an interview this morning where that was the framework that then led into my talking. And I thought that that was interesting, that people just assume that that is what climate anxiety entirely is trying to cope with. And Kari Norgaard, an environmental sociologist, has done some work on realizing to come to the conclusion that it is easier for most Americans to imagine an apocalypse than a post-fossil fuel society. And this is a striking problem because, of course, this is a problem of the radical imagination about what kind of future that a climate change future might look like where human beings could thrive. And so this leads me to think about folks like Adrienne Maree Brown and a lot of other people who are thinking about world building and Afrofuturism, and thinking about what kinds of futures where there's actually a possibility for both human and environmental justice. So the lack of an imagination about that is really a crisis. Young people, at least my students, feel like their life course is unclear and it won't be like previous generations. And relatedly, they feel that it's cruel to bring children into this world. This is based on a lot of research that's out there. You can find data around how many young people feel all of these things if you Google it and do some research. So I'm indirectly citing some research here. This isn't just my students anecdotally. And the term that I used to think about my students is eco-nihilism. I feel their energy so despairing that they can barely come to class. And certainly in our brochures and all of our websites, we talk about promising to turn idealistic young people into citizen leaders of the climate movement, climate warriors, whatever. And that seems like a very, very, very high bar when they can barely come to class because they're so depressed about the content. This was really what triggered me to think that this was something that required a change in education. So we know recent data is really honing in on this question of youth, that concern is higher among youth. And you can see here in these countries, and of course we can talk about a different point, why these countries, what about Greece and South Korea, I'm not really going to talk about those details, but just to give you a little glimpse into some data about this age spread of concern. In the blue on the right, you see the younger you are, the higher your concern, and the older you get, the less you're concerned about climate change. And from that report that I mentioned earlier from the Lancet, there are some really interesting data. I just want to give you some nuggets of that. Nearly 60% of the people interviewed in that youth survey said that they felt worried or extremely worried. And more than 45% of those questions said that feelings about the climate affected their daily lives. 3/4 of them said that they thought the future was frightening. And over half say they think humanity is doomed. And about 1 in 3, 1 in 4, somewhere between 1 in 3, 1 in 4, don't want to have children because of the climate. Now, I think just as a side note, kind of a footnote to that, that's a fascinating, there's a fascinating shift in the reproductive refusal story of this generation. In the past, in the 60s and 70s, sort of population bomb, zero population growth moment of the environmental movement, before climate was totally part of the conversation, it was really the environmental movement. The argument, or the foundation of the argument to not have children, was very much based on kind of a neo-Malthusian argument of population growth outstripping the resources available, and thereby refraining from reproduction was an environmental act of self-sacrifice, that you weren't going to add that level of impact onto the environment. Alternatively, quite different now, the reason that people are wanting not to have children is not because of that argument so much as it is because of the idea that the planet itself will be uninhabitable for their children in their lifetime. And that, I think, is a very different existential sort of fear than the kind of ethics about not reproducing. Okay, so that was just a little, wading into the shallow end of the pool about what I think climate anxiety is. We can talk about it in Q&A, whether this is a useful term entirely, what the sort of pros and cons of it. But that's what got me kind of hooked into thinking about the topic, and why I thought climate anxiety was a really important thing to focus on with my students. In terms of where I'm going to go from here, I want to make the case that emotions are really important for climate justice, for climate work, for climate education, for climate activism, and that is a story that is not told enough. And so that's what I really want to spend a significant amount of time on. And then I'll do a little foray into the inner practices that I outline in A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. I do believe that a lot of what holds us back from the most effective work on climate change is actually stuff that's interior, mental, their mindset issues, and not for everybody all the time. But I do think it's fascinating that in the 2022 IPCC report, for the first time ever, we see them calling for what they call an inner transition of values and mindsets. So this was something that my students brought to my attention, and then now is actually mainstream conversation. I'm going to dive in a little bit more detail on one of the chapters of my book called Hack the Story, and just use that as one example to think about how that might help us navigate some of those ways that my students were presenting, especially that sense of inefficacy at the size of the problem. And then I have these slides where I talk about really strategies, how we might think about the inner transition as a leverage point, as Donella Meadows would call it, for political change. And then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for a conversation with each other and any responses that you might have to those questions and follow-up. So why do emotions matter? Well, the research is becoming increasingly clear on this. Whether we've applied this to our actual lives is a different question entirely, but emotions dictate our decision-making, the retention of knowledge. This is really fascinating in terms of the role of emotions in education. I don't know any PhD who came out and became a professor and who makes their living off of teaching young people, who understands how much emotions affect our students' ability to retain the knowledge in our classrooms, much less engage or succeed. So the role of emotions in education, the role of emotions in decision-making, the capacity to build community, which is an essential antidote to climate problems, our ability to have response-able actions, meaning not just reactive kind of soothing our anxiety, dopamine types of actions, but rather actions that are in response to the bigger picture for the long term, things that are not cognitively necessarily totally easy to grasp. And our ability to engage in meaningful work despite setbacks. And this is what I think of as resilience, although we can talk about the pros and cons of that term too. But the ability to engage in meaningful work despite setbacks goes to this question of, if I can't see the results of my efforts, what is the point of even doing it? And I think that the ability to continue to stay engaged in work without having to have evidence of the impact is something that Rebecca Solnit writes about, lots of wisdom traditions think about, that is really essential for this moment that we're in. And I think of that as what I call in my book, climate wisdom. And of course, data and reason-based appeals, we think those are the things that are going to get people to care. And certainly most climate science people who I know start with data as a way to get people to care. And I call this the litany trope, right? Like listing all of the scientific research that's out there about all the problems that are happening in the world as a way to get people to care. Turns out emotions are much stronger than data. And Kari Norgaard and other sociologists call this the information deficit myth. This notion that if we just give everybody more information, more science, more facts, then they'll know what the right thing to do is, and they will do it. And it turns out that that's not at all true. Additionally, the science of emotion shows that different emotions shape climate action in different ways. And I think we really should be strategic about this. I mean, we can't police emotions, we can't manufacture them or turn switches on and off, but certainly the research on things like mindfulness and the research on things like emotional intelligence do show that with more diving deep into and more awareness of emotions, we can in fact create conditions for the kinds of mindsets and emotional states that we know enable us to be as capacity built as possible around the kinds of actions that we take part in and how much energy we have for different kinds of political actions. And I think, for example, the really wonderful example of this, of course, is fear. The emotion of fear, it turns out, does in fact activate action because it triggers the amygdala and it makes people get off of their seats to try to prevent a threat. And that is a really wonderful aspect of fear. Fear is an important emotion to let us know something is wrong and we should do something to fix it. However, as we know from politics and we know from our own lives, there are times when fear makes us react in ways that in fact undermine our best interests or undermine the best interests of other people and in fact can do harm. And fear works in politics in all kinds of ways. So thinking about fear or guilt or pleasure or joy or all kinds of even much more nuanced emotions is something that people who are diving into these questions. What kinds of utility do each of these emotions have with different types of audiences and different populations and communities for engaging them in climate action and climate change issues? So I think this is a really fascinating topic of study. Suppression of grief and anger and so-called negative or uncomfortable emotions. Many people who are thinking about this question from sort of a mindfulness or psychology perspective are saying that the suppression of these emotions only serves to fuel the problem even more. So it does things like makes people want to numb out and distract themselves with sort of quick dopamine fixes like swiping and shopping and that sort of thing. And that the inability to really face the awful information and the awful news and the consequences emotionally, if we actually do face that, is part of the reason why people are not actually getting engaged as much as they should. So that such an emotion as denial, for example, is really an elegant cognitive solution to not being able to face the gravity of the truth of this. And so people are arguing, if we could actually sort of remove the toxic positivity culture of most American society and get people to be more comfortable with these uncomfortable emotions that result from this information, we would actually be in a much better position to face this stuff. And we also know from any social movement, we know that our mental and our physical health affects our ability to engage in climate justice or any kind of political movement that we want to be a part of. And so if we think about our bodies and our minds and our hearts as the sort of tanks that need to be filled up, to use a terrible metaphor, right? But if we think about the strength and health and vitality of our minds and bodies as really essential to the work of climate justice, not just the sort of byproduct or externalized cost of our climate justice activism, which is the way I find most activists think about their health. Then we might think about this quite differently. And instead of just thinking about climate change affecting mental health in these bad ways, we might also want to turn the conversation around, which I'll talk about in a minute a little bit more, to think about how does mental health help us mitigate climate change, right? Why is mental health really a front line for our ability to do work on climate change? And I just want to focus a little bit on this question of different emotions shape climate change action in different ways. This particular insight is going to help us navigate our way through the question of hacking the story, which I'll get to in a minute. So what does this mean for the climate? What are all of these insights about why emotions matter relevant for our ability to deal with climate change? This is a question I asked in my book and tried to answer in my book. And the chapter titles are all kind of the toolkit or the sort of skill sets that I came up with for thinking about the answer to that question. First of all, trying to figure out how we're going to embrace life in the Anthropocene. And this is sort of, if we think about stages of guilt, stages of grief, or different types of arcways of emotional processing, this is sort of the acceptance stage, if you want to put it that way. Getting schooled on the role of emotions in climate justice work. This has to do with the point I just mentioned earlier about how it is that different emotions shape our ability to engage in anything. And it varies depending on who you are, positionality, your relative access to mental health resources, that sort of thing. And I mentioned earlier what I call climate wisdom. This chapter is sort of articulating what is it that climate wisdom is and why might we need that, especially for young people who are having to grow up into wisdom maybe faster than previous generations have before them. Claiming your calling and scale your action has very much to do with this argument of you might be small, but you are what we've got. And that is the only thing we all have. Adrienne Brown has a principle of her book, Emergent Strategy, that says small is all. And there's a sense that I think a lot of young people, but many of us feel that we are so small we can't do anything. And this chapter really tries to address that by critiquing the myth of the individual in particular. And then there's a chapter on hacking the story, and I'm going to get into that chapter as soon as I'm done with this table of contents. Being less right and more in relation. This is really counterintuitive also. Many of the sort of prescriptions in these chapters are really counterintuitive for dominant climate culture, climate activism, sort of the accepted ethos and accepted discourse of climate culture. Many of these ideas are sort of against those things, actually not intuitive, but they're certainly against mainstream American culture that we're all swimming in this water. So this notion of being less right and more in relation, this has very much to do with what would happen if we prioritize relationships with each other, with ourselves, with a more than human world, more than we prioritize being correct or right or winning arguments. And then the 7th chapter is called Ditch Guilt, Move Beyond Hope, and Laugh More. And in here, I play around with that point of the earlier highlighted thing about what are these different emotions like guilt and hope and laughter and pleasure? How do they shape climate action? Resisting burnout, of course, has a particular valence for the climate movement, and I wanted to speak to them in particular, not just any generic burnout from work or whatever. And then finally, Feed What You Want to Grow is really my personal favorite chapter. Is the prescription that I find I need the most in my life, and this has to do with the sort of very common wisdom tradition tenet, which is that what you pay attention to grows, which is the way Adrian Brown puts it. But you can think about it as where your mind flows, your energy goes, that kind of thing. And so this notion that if fear, in fact, causes us to be dysregulated and not act in service of what we love in our lives, what is it that we can do to switch our attention away from the things that we fear and towards the things that we love, that the fear is worried about, is threatening? And so this is where that chapter goes. How do we shift our attention to nurturing that which we love and thinking about building a world where we can thrive in a climate change future? So just kind of honing in on this particular one, hacking the story. Why does the story we live in matter? And I use this picture of the Pacific Islander climate action movement, where they try to refute the dominant narrative that's happening in IPCC and in COP. We have COP coming up around the corner, COP27, that the inevitability of the temperature change, of the global temperature change, is sort of accepted in these negotiations. And this is a form of resistance to that story of inevitability. That notion that we are not drowning inevitably. You can't just wipe us off the planet by creating a story of inevitable doom. We are in fact fighting. And what they mean by that, of course, is that we are fighting to write a different story, right? And I'm thinking here of, there was a beautiful essay that just came out, if you're interested in this kind of critique of the inevitability trope within So Much Climate. Rebecca Solnit just wrote a beautiful piece on it in The Statesman a couple of days ago. So thinking about the story we live in, right? So a person who's really quite famous in the climate movement for thinking about the power of story is Joanna Macy. And Joanna Macy's work on the Great Unraveling, Business as Usual, and the Great Turning Stories is really effective for as an example to think this through. So in the story of the Great Unraveling, which is just a story that we tell ourselves in the news or we consume, we believe this is the water that we're swimming in oftentimes, right? That this story draws attention to the disasters caused by industrial growth society. It's a story of ongoing derangement and collapse of biological, ecological, and all the systems. The climate is unraveling, and we're going to be entering the 6th great extinction. Of course, we know Elizabeth Colbert's book on this. Hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, wildfires, ecosystems are being destroyed. It feels a little bit like Revelation, and my heart rate rises when I read something like this. Military operations and conflicts, famine, drought, racism, longstanding cultural and religious enmities flare up, taking an immeasurable toll, of course, on human suffering. And so, just pausing for a moment. This is really the story that the vast majority of media that we consume is telling us on a sort of daily basis. We have unprecedented access, 24/7 news from around the globe, and it is no surprise that that this is the story that we believe to be true. And so this is where I want to begin. What does that do to us? What are the key elements of this story of the Great Unraveling? First, one element is that it feels like that the way that the story is going is inevitable. There's nothing we can do to stop it. It's almost like a natural progression. And of course, it's a story of decline. So it's sort of like it used to be good, but it's heading down. Things are going really bad and the future is going to be terrible. This is actually built into some really American tropes like the Jeremiah or the declensionist narrative that we see even in something like a mantra like Make America Great Again, right? This notion that something was really good in the past, this nostalgia for something awesome that is in decline and it's inevitably going to fall off the edge of the cliff. The scale of the effects is so big that nobody can control it or influence it. So that hence creates the inevitability of the crisis. And there's no specificity of actors doing the harm. And there's a very pessimistic view of humanity and human nature there. Also, no evidence, countervailing evidence of progress or pathways for solutions. And the intended emotional effects, of course, are fear, anxiety, resignation, and apathy. And I put this image in the back, which I hope you are mostly all recognizing, of a similar kind of story built into a very simple piece of art. So many pieces of art, things that don't even have words in them at all, can also reflect the very same key elements of the story of the Great Unraveling. When we think about the warming stripes from 1850 to 2017, the global temperature increasing here from the blue to the red, in that time period, we see this sort of march of time from left to right, and we see this, the inevitability built into this, we see the decline built into this, we don't see any specificity of actors. So even the warming stripes, which is a beautiful symbolic representation of climate alarmism, and we've come to see it as that, it's become sort of part of our vernacular, is participating in this story of the great unraveling, I would venture to say. So what does the story do to our capacity to respond? This is where the psychology and the emotions is really critical. If we think about what Dan Siegel calls the window of tolerance, or in trauma circles, people call it the range of resilience, where individual people, when they are operating from within the space of what's called the range of resilience, or this green zone, or the window of tolerance, we tend to be able to make decisions after receiving information or stimulus, a threat response, in a way that's wise, self-protective, but also doesn't necessarily participate in harming of others or the more than human world. We're able to think about longer term benefits of our actions. We're able to keep our values in mind and not just think about the sort of immediate fight, flight, or freeze threat that's right in front of us. And that is the optimal zone from which, if we are acting in service of climate, because climate is oftentimes a big abstraction that we have to use our prefrontal cortex is fully to act in service of. Is if we're acting from the range of resilience, then we tend to be doing the best we can to not harm others and to do things for the climate. But if we're triggered outside of our range of resilience into hyper or hypoarousal, we tend to not be able to make decisions responsibly. We react impulsively. And a lot of times people ask me, how do I turn my climate anxiety into action? And I think to myself, well, actually, in some cases, action is just a response to being triggered outside of a range of resilience, and doesn't necessarily mean that that action is good for the climate, right? So there's lots of actions we can take just to soothe our dysregulation around information that's coming in, right? So I want us to slow down the time between getting a stimulus and action, and spend some time thinking in that pause, what is going on? What is that triggering me? What is the fear that I have? Where does that show me that I love and I want to, protect or nurture, and go through kind of an interior process of things before we actually react. And as we know, the mind and the body are not so separate, and things that are causing us chronic or acute stress in our minds and our hearts are not good for systems in the body either, and vice versa. So I put this on here just to point out the fact that the mind-body binary is not something that is useful in this work. If we want to see this in another way, we can think about climate disruption kicking off a feedback loop of reactivity on the left, or alternatively resilience on the right. And I'll talk about the reactivity one first. If climate disruption kicks off climate-induced reactivity in us, and we're not able to be in our resilience zone, we are less likely to be functional and positive and contribute well and create the kinds of structures that we want to, that are life affirming and climate attentive, climate centric. And this is in fact going to lead to our decreased ability to mitigate for climate change, which will in fact increase climate disruption. So this is the feedback loop that I think is critical here. It's not just that climate change is going to affect mental health. Here we see that our capacity, our inner capacity, is essential for being able to mitigate against climate change. Ideally, we're at a point, as many people who are thinking about the inner transition are calling for, where we're sort of being born into a new moment, where all of a sudden we realize that the mindsets of values of culture, dominant culture, have been really extractive and awful, colonial, capitalist, exploitative, and that this is going to kick off a radical culture change. And this will then enable us to increase our climate mitigation and decrease climate disruption. So this is another way of thinking about this as a feedback loop. Morgan Florsheim wrote a beautiful essay in the Yes magazine, which I love. I recommend it strongly, where she articulates this feedback loop in her own way. And I think it's almost even easier to understand it from her personal perspective. She says, depression tells us that we are at once powerless and culpable, and therefore the only logical response is to disengage, turn inward, eschew connection. A response which only serves to reinforce the oppressive systems like racial justice and capitalism that are truly responsible for our suffering in the first place. And what I love about the way she articulates this is that we can see it going both ways, right? The political systems of racial injustice and capitalism are kicking off this kind of feedback effect that will result in us turning inward and therefore decreasing our ability to fix those structures. So there's a real sense of the cycle here. So another key concept in thinking about what effect these stories have on us is this concept of pseudo-efficacy. And I'm citing here the work that's in this book, Numbers and Nerves, and the social psychologists like Paul Slovic and Ezra Markowitz and other folks who are thinking about what is the psychological tools that we need to do this work in conservation and climate action. Pseudo-efficacy is a concept that basically says the idea is that people are less likely to offer help if they think the problem is too big for them to solve. The positive feeling of solving even a small part of that big problem is outweighed by the negative feeling of not solving the whole. This is also known as the drop in the bucket imaginary. And this was discovered in an experiment, and don't ask me about the experiment, go read the book about this, called the child in the pond scenario, which is Peter Singer's from the, I believe, 70s, extrapolated for this more contemporary question. And whereby if people walk past a child that's drowning in a pond, they're very likely to want to save that child. But if they walk past multiple ponds with drowning children in it, they're less likely to even try to save one child, because the feeling of not being able to save all the children causes them to feel pseudo-inefficacious. So there's this experiment that has implications for thinking about big problems like climate change. And this goes to speak to the point I made earlier about how the big problem is so big and we feel too small to do anything about it. The pseudo-inefficacious aspects of the climate story are probably the number one leverage point that I feel so strongly about, thinking about how can we disrupt that. Relatedly, as many of you are probably familiar with this concept of the negativity bias, our brains being like Teflon for positive information, just slipping off of them, and our brains being like Velcro, as Rick Hansen puts it, for negative information, negative news. The reptilian part of our brain wants to focus in on bad news, and bad news, therefore, is provided for us because of our eyeballs and dollars and all the things that, that supply creates the demand for, or demand creates the supply of the kinds of news that we get about the world and the great unraveling. And so, of course, our negativity bias leads us, unless we are cognizant of it and disrupt it, to consuming the kinds of news that therefore perpetuates it, becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. As we see, this goes in both directions. There's negativity bias in news, and there's also negativity bias in us. So what is happening here? In a really simple way, negativity bias and our perception of risk that's controlled by the negativity bias leads us to living in a story of the great unraveling, leads us to a sense of pseudo-inefficacy, and also things like psychic numbing and empathic distress are things that I don't need to define. I'm sure you can imagine what those things are, which are dysregulated states, right? And this leads us to inaction and perhaps a self-fulfilling prophecy of bringing about the very story of the great unraveling that we most fear. Alternatively, Joanna Macy says, the great turning is an alternative story that we might want to live in. This is a story of a transition from industrial growth society to a life-sustaining society, when our attitudes shift, when people become more interwoven and see themselves as having solidarity with one another, and they ultimately join together to act for the sake of life on Earth. Examples of this emerged as we saw. I don't know if you all felt this with your students or in your communities, but in the middle of COVID, this notion of being on the precipice of a great turning or in the middle of a great turning was really palpable to me, as is evidenced oftentimes by art, right? Art often calls forth this possibility of what else is true besides the great unraveling, and the critical nature of living in a different story than the one that dominant society is telling us, because the people that benefit the most from the story of the great unraveling and the inefficacious inaction that results is, in fact, of course, those people who are existing in power. So as this mural states, in the middle of coronavirus, in the middle of COVID, we will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal, other than we normalized green, inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction. We should not long to return. We are being given a new opportunity to stitch a new garment. And similarly, Valerie Carr writes, what if the darkness that we're in is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? So these are sort of art examples of bringing forth the great turning. Similarly, if we want to use this kind of bookended example of the warming stripes, just overlaying a few of these words here gives this notion of, hey, we're actually located in this story and we have some agency to do something about it. So the key elements here, the future is ours to make. Progress is possible. A movement of helpers, to use Mr. Rogers' mom's phrase, exists, right? This is the collective. The awareness of the collective is critical here because it diminishes individualism and alienation. What I do matters inside that collective. Specific people and extractive systems are to blame. It won't make the news. None of this stuff is going to make the news. And the intended emotional effects, of course, are efficacy, empowerment, and other emotions that keep us coming back to keep doing the work. So thinking about the inner transition as the critical place for social change, for the sort of a theory of change, if we think about Donella Meadows' idea of the leverage points in a system, as she even argued as an economist, the inner work is the most important, that it has the most leverage in changing a system. The mental models that are at the bottom of this iceberg that shape all of the other systems are the point of most leverage because they're at the root of it. Paul Hawken puts it a different way. He says the most complex radical climate technology on Earth is the human heart and mind, not a solar panel. And I love thinking of the heart and mind as a technology of climate change here. So as I come to wrapping up, I want to think about, so what does this all add up to? What do I actually go and do? Do I need to go and do anything? What is the work I'm doing on my mind, to think of it as a solar panel here, as the equivalent of that? First, one skill, build capacity in our minds and bodies for long-term engagement. And this is simply a matter of self-care, right? Some of breakthrough inquiries, I might try to crack open what might help us do this in a more effective way. Thinking about what would it take to see ourselves as efficacious? How might you cultivate a mindset and practices of resilience, engagement, and relationship? What would change in your life if you saw your well-being as the front lines of climate advocacy? Secondly, mindfulness of our emotions so we know how to be our most skillful selves and expand the resilient zone. So what does our distress point to? How is capitalism operating through us? How are we agents of that destruction and that brainwashing? Can we become aware of the stories we live in and that water we're swimming in? Can we cultivate wisdom at the benefit of these negative, so-called negative emotions, and approach our work with equanimity and compassion? More critical connection, less critical mass. Or as I put it in my book, be less right and more in relation. If community trust and collaboration are the medicine for both social and ecological ailments, what would our work look like if we valued relationships more than anything else? This changed completely the way I teach. Hack the story and pay attention to your attention. So this is the real crux of what I talked about today. What stories are we consuming, creating, living in, and asking others to live in? We are constantly producing stories. We're story creators all the time. Every time we share something or like something, we're feeding the life of some story. And what else is true besides the doom story that we've been thinking is true? Heal the world with a radical imagination. So this goes to Kari Norgaard's point about being able to imagine a future. What do we desire about the future? Can we focus less on the stuff that needs to change and more on the stuff that we want to grow? And finally, resisting urgency. How does the mindset of urgency kind of hijack our hearts and prevent us from acting wisely in service of that which we love the most? How might our perception of urgency and time undermine our very best efforts and our values? And just to finish up, some favorite quotes that are relevant here. So I'm standing on the shoulders of all of these people and all of these wonderful social movement leaders. Audre Lorde's argument that caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Again, bringing the emotional out into the political public sphere. Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, many of you have probably read it. In that she writes, even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. And this is a very different way of thinking about things than just what's my impact, right? And does my impact is a net positive, net negative? It doesn't make a difference. Is it just a drop in the bucket? This just shatters that mindset entirely. Clarissa Pinkola Estes' poem, We Were Made for These Times, in that she writes, ours is not the task of fixing the entire world at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach. And this is a quote that I love to share with students because there's that sense of the problem being so big, right? And then, of course, the Nat Bishop, Tricia Hersey just published her fantastic book, Rest is Resistance. And she argues that rest is a form of resistance because it disrupts and pushes back against capitalism and white supremacy. And so this notion of how do we prevent and stop the grind culture and the productivist imaginary of capitalism, even in our activism, from working through us as agents of that. And Bayoka Malafe, of course, has written us something similar. These times are urgent. that's all the more reason that we must slow down. And so there's sort of counterintuitive notions of urgency and time. And Andrea Marie Brown, as I've cited her many times, she's sort of an idol of mine. I just think everything she produces is so fast, so fantastic and necessary for the climate justice movement. She says, we have to make justice the most pleasurable experience humans can have. And again, very counterintuitive around what the climate movement is about. So I'm going to wrap up and just say that I'm involved in some things that I'd love you to reach out to me about if you are interested, things that can be joined. I have a network of people. I'm collaborating with Jennifer Atkinson, Ellen Kelsey, and Pano Piccola, an existential toolkit for climate justice educators. We have a website. We're just doing whatever comes up, a discussion group every month. Online, it's got people from 9 countries now in it. Please feel free to reach out and join that group if you're interested in participating. And people are thinking about the relationship between climate, justice, emotions, and education, and especially in higher education. But there are people in that group who are in other setting, other ages. And then environment justice and the politics of emotion is a symposium I'm organizing with Jade Sasser and Blanche Burley in April 2023. It's at UC Riverside. The call for papers for this has already passed, but if you're interested in coming or attending or having some real role in it, please reach out to me. And then things that you can, that I offer is the Climate Wisdom Lab that Dr. Henning was mentioning earlier. If you have a group of people who wants to figure out how to integrate the science of emotion into your work more, let me know. I have a colleague who runs something called Emergent Resilience. His name is Kevin Gallagher, and we do this work together. These are all collaborations. And then finally, if you want to do some mindfulness around this work, transforming climate anxiety, please let me know. I'm going to be offering a class in the spring again through Pacific Mindfulness as I'm wrapping up my mindfulness teacher training this year. So please let me know if any of these things are of interest to any of you. And thank you very much for your time. And I hope we have plenty of time, Dr. Henning, for questions and conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ray. This is just such a full plate. So while people are formulating their questions in the Q&A, so I would ask everybody to think about a question if you have one. You can also sort of participate by voting questions up or down. So if you'd like to make sure I consider posing a question to our speaker, also you can click the little up thumb to upvote things. While you're doing that, I'd like to start us off by actually posting a quotation in the chat from your book on hope. So you write, acceptance, not hope, is the remedy for nihilism. The ability to accept the seeming contradiction that the world is dying, even while we operate from a place of hope and desire, is the aim of spiritual awakening. In Buddhist terms, learning how to die and accepting impermanence are not as morbid as they sound. On the contrary, acceptance of mortality enables us, ironically, to cherish life. And so I wanted to start with this passage about hope, because that's such a potent aspect of this. And some might say, expect maybe when they read your book, like what you're trying to do is, as an antidote, is hope, and then they get these passages and they're maybe pause. And so I'd love to give you an opportunity to share a little bit more your thinking about that aspect of the book before we jump into the Q&A feature down there.
You pulled out the most complex, most challenging quote of the whole book. You want me to just talk about that for a few minutes before we go on to the other questions? Just death, that's all.
Yeah.
This is the one that I get the most pushback on, because it is the most counterintuitive, I think, especially to the dominant American sensibility, and also especially young people in a culture that really, really fetishizes youth. We struggle with this one, and I think it really does take some kind of aspects of wisdom, if not a spiritual approach to these things. And it doesn't have to, it can be a completely secular approach, but there's an existential journey that's happening here about things are really bad. Things are, in fact, as Buddhists call it, impermanent, right? And the suffering is caused by the fact that we're attached to their permanence, not because of the loss of it per se, but the impermanence aspect of it. And I think one of the things that's been really extraordinary for me is to do a lot of research into grief, and the concept of grief, and how people in different cultures and different religious traditions think about and deal with grief. And in this passage, I think is probably in a section where I go into a lot on grief in general, and that there's this kind of there's a lot of paradoxes in here. Part of wisdom and part of acquiring wisdom is finding ways to kind of balance multiple truths at once. And one of those multiple truths at once is that the more you accept that this is all bad stuff, this is really bad news, the more there's potential there to accept also that you are willing to give your life towards protecting life, right? I mean, that you're not in affirming ecosystem health and all that kind of stuff. So I think that there's some insights here about paradox that I found really helpful in my own kind of spiritual journey through this work that I would love. I feel like, oh, we just don't have space for paradox in dominant political conversation. There's no possibility for nuance. There's no gray area. There's only these binary options. And for example, for hope, you really wanted me to talk about hope. Hope has a little bit of both and going on it, right? There's the problem of hope, which is that it kind of defers responsibility to the future or to somebody else, that hope kind of lulls us into complacency ourselves, and that hopelessness is in fact potentially a more motivating emotion. There's different types of hope. People talk about lots of different types of hope. Joanna Macy's book is called Active Hope, and we have many, many modifiers. Christiana Figueres calls in her book, The Future We Choose, she talks about gritty optimism. So there's all kinds of ways that Martin Luther King and a social movement people, all kinds of people much wiser than I have really dived into this question of whether hope is a useful emotion for any kind of activism. And I recommend, exploring the emotion of hope in all these places. But I tried to synthesize that a little bit in that chapter on moving beyond hope is the section of the book that talks about that. We need to feel we have some control over the conditions of our lives. That could be defined as hope, but that can also be defined as much more granular and specific stuff too, that I think is more useful to think about. And I'm not saying we should get rid of hope. I'm just saying there's probably other emotions that are more useful to think about.
I think that's a great, I'm sorry I posed a difficult one, but I thought you handled it really well. Folks are interested in Amelia Marchand's question, which is, have you or those in your field worked collaboratively with Indigenous peoples to help inform your grief work about intergenerational trauma and resilience?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, of course, this notion of climate anxiety as a phenomenon, this is something that I tried to explore in an essay I wrote called Climate Anxiety is an Overwhelmingly White Phenomenon. And that was a title that actually Scientific American gave to the piece, and I wouldn't have chosen that title myself. So, but where I tried to interrogate the kind of racial aspects of the concept of climate anxiety. What is the cultural work that the phenomenon or concept of climate anxiety is doing in American culture? Not so much what should we do to deal with it, taking it as for granted that it exists and it is an actual thing. I actually want to interrogate that even more. But the person who I'm thinking about the most has sort of the best effective critique of the concept of climate anxiety from an Indigenous perspective is actually Kyle Powis White's work, where he talks about climate anxiety. We can call what Indigenous peoples and the Americans have been feeling since 1492 climate anxiety, but what is the utility of that? And how does it maybe erase the nuances of how different people in different communities have different contact points and relationships with these extractive systems? And different types of emotions even are culturally situated and culturally constructed. One type of person and one type of language and one type of moment of history and one type of, assigned gender or whatever might have access to some types of emotions more than others. And our language dictates to us which ones are available to us anyway. And so I think climate anxiety is not necessarily an objective emotion that anybody who's worried about the climate experiences. I think that it's very much inflected through these lenses of identity for sure. And as a result, the vast majority of people who are talking about climate anxiety have not been Indigenous, have been white. And the Indigenous communities that I work with would say, my community doesn't experience this emotion. This is not a relevant conversation for us. But that doesn't mean that they're not experiencing something related to climate and something like anxiety. But the utility of whitewashing it all as one emotion with this modifier climate, I think, is very questionable. In fact, problematic, right? It sort of has the effect of centering the white experience again. So yeah, I would say from the work I've done in reading and talking with Indigenous people about this concept, that it's not a very useful concept, that other concepts like trauma, intergenerational trauma you mentioned, colonialism are in fact much more useful concepts. And of course, Climate change is something that Kyle Powers White says happened when, wasn't something that started with the Industrial Revolution. It started with colonization. And so that changes the conversation around who has access to the emotion of climate anxiety and why. Is really, really interesting question. And of course, the notion that one would need to have resilience, wisdom. I mean, I'm putting all these words in quote marks, right? These are sort of white Western concepts that I'm using here, is not new to many social movements. And it's certainly not new to any community who's had other existential threats for generations, right? So this notion that climate would be the greatest existential threat of our time is something that people like Marianne East Heglar and other people have pushed back on and said, hey, what about people who have been experiencing other existential threats and might not put climate as the number one, which she calls climate exceptionalism, right? That climate is somehow a bigger problem than any of the other ones that other communities have been feeling. So there's really good, important pushbacks on the concept. That's not quite your question, but I'll just leave it there for now.
So one of our Gonzaga students, Jordan Cruz, asks, how do we balance the seriousness of the climate crisis while not falling into the rabbit holes of eco-nihilism and doom?
Yeah, that's the wisdom piece, right? You cultivate practices of wisdom. That's super easy to say and a lot harder to do. So there's absolutely both and. There are multiple truths happening at once here. The way that I approach it in the book and the way I approach it in my own personal life and teach about it, and I'm not sure how it lands on everybody. Some people find it useful, some people might not. So I'm not sure, Jordan, you will find this useful. But I happen to know that my negativity, once we start to learn how to hack the habits of our minds, by learning the biases that the vast majority of minds have, right? We have all kinds of biases that are not based in reality because of the ways that our amygdala and our systems, our threat response has been evolutionary trained to save and protect ourselves, right? So some of these are not really useful anymore, or they're out of date, or they're not applied to the reality we live in. And the more we become aware of the biases of our minds, the more we're able to counterbalance them or sort of build other muscles in other directions to live in different stories. And so what I'm suggesting is that when we feel that slip into the rabbit hole, we know where that's going to take us. We know if we know this, if we become mindful, which is one of those skills, right? If we're mindful of how that feels to start the slip, we can actually stop that slip, knowing that where that's going to take us is not actually into motivation, effectiveness in our actions, good relationship building, any of the things that we might think are really critical steps towards climate action. Slipping into that rabbit hole is counterproductive and a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so we actually prevent ourselves from doing that because we know that the very thing we love and care about, which is planetary health, is at risk if we go down that hole. So we take it very seriously as just a no-go. It's not allowed, like a child running across the street, no, I'm not going down that rabbit hole, It's that important is what I'm saying. Doesn't, again.
Reminds me of another passage that I was hoping to ask you about. Page 135, I posted it in the chat. You say, interior work is not just useful for sustaining the external work, it's the greatest form of resistance to the unjust structures we seek to change. If the effort to thrive undermines our ability to thrive, we are serving our own oppression. It's such an interesting sort of conversation about this interior work versus the exterior work, right? And I worry that someone might hear this as sort of we need to turn to the self-help aisle, and I know that is not what you're saying. I want to give you the opportunity to sort of yes, but no.
Yeah. I mean, this goes to Audre Lorde's point, and this is also Tricia Hersey's argument and Russ's resistance. This notion that if in the process, so if we think about the greatest resistance, the thing that's most likely to change capitalism as we know it, the thing that's most likely to lead to what Joanna Macy calls the great turning, the just transition that we all hope for. This is all stuff that if we have no energy and we are in fact unhealthy and we are literally and figuratively killing ourselves with the stress of the work of it, then it just does the work for them, right? I mean, it does the sort of, oh, in fighting us, they've destroyed themselves. How great, then we win, right? There's a sense of, Tricia Hersey articulates this, and Audre Lorde, of course, articulates this, that the inner resilience, the inner resolve, the inner strength is in fact the most important act of political warfare, is the way Audre Lorde puts it. But we don't often think about, in dominant white society, this notion of the interior as an exterior resource, right? I mean, we like to keep them really separated and really clear binaries around mental, physical health as a binary that I think is bogus, of course, and wisdom traditions and indigenous communities have known this forever. And the medical models, don't address that at all, or something like interior work versus exterior activism. We simply cannot figure out what the most effective actions that we should take are unless we do some interior work to figure it out, right? So there's a sense of the interior work being a kind of action. In my book, I try to provoke us to think that we think of interior work as passive and then activism as active and action, but we ought to think about as Hersey puts it, rest as a form of resistance, or that's a provocation to have us think about things that we think of as stillness or passivity, if leveraged politically, are extremely important for political change.
I love it, as that idea from Lorde is an act of resistance. That's such a cool way of putting it. So the Gonzaga Climate Center runs some professional development workshops for K-12 teachers. So it's a lot on my mind about how to incorporate what you're talking about into professional development work for K-12 teachers. And I don't know if this person, Katie Thorson, is an educator herself, themselves, but they ask, in the beginning, you talked about how teaching climate change throughout different classes and subjects has overwhelmed students. How would you change the educational system without losing that knowledge from different perspectives on climate change?
That's a really great question. I love that question. So first of all, somebody had mentioned indigenous practices. I do think that there is something here about not treating climate education in the dominant sort of Western scientific positivistic model and coming at it from perspectives of, for example, decolonization, or perspectives of racial capitalism, or something like that. There's so many people who are talking about climate change from other perspectives that are not these dominant perspectives. And the problem is that the way the K through 12 is, you're sort of beholden to a curriculum in general. And that's my understanding, that you're sort of beholden to a curriculum. And climate change has only just recently gotten some recognition of being important for K through 12 curriculum. So I'm not, it's sort of hard to say, okay, now that we've won this very hard won thing, let's tweak it and change it and throw it out the window or whatever. But there's all kinds of developmentally appropriate ways of thinking about climate change. Ellen Kelsey writes about the fact that, we talk about censorship and all kinds of other things around sex education, and all of these emotionally heavy things like grief, or how do you talk to a kid about grief? Oh, there's different ages, you do it differently. But we don't have the same kind of sense of there are emotional stages that young people are capable of handling different types of information. And when you tell a young person at the age of 6 that the planet is doomed, this can create a kind of trauma that can cause them to have effects throughout the rest of their lives that they have to deal with. So that there's a sense of people who are cognizant of trauma-informed education, or maybe more cognizant of thinking about age, developmentally appropriate types of information, how to teach things in a developmentally appropriate way. These are the people who I think are really helpful to weigh in on that question. That said, there's the really simple answer is doom and gloom doesn't work, and it certainly doesn't work the younger you are. And the thing that makes people afraid and scared and anxious about climate change is because they have a recognition. Jaquette Ray says that climate anxiety is merely a sign that you are connected to the world. And so climate anxiety is actually a very, very positive sign, right? It's people who don't feel climate anxiety, who don't feel that connection, that we want to worry about in some ways. That, which isn't to say that if you don't feel, you can be appreciative of interconnection and not feel climate anxiety too. I very much want to acknowledge that. But there's a sense of, cultivating the conditions of interconnectedness and recognition of interconnectedness that ought to be happening in the K through 12. The sense of imminent doom and apocalypse is a completely useless lesson. Efficacy, how do you teach young people that they are efficacious in their lives and that they matter and that they can contribute their skills and passions in ways that matter? How do they build community? How do they learn how relationship is more important than being right? How do they come to honor and do as least harm in the way they walk around in the world to other creatures in the more than human world? All of these are skills that we all really, really need, and I never was taught. So, I think about the many, many, many skills that ought to happen in climate education K through 12 way, 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 way before, and completely irrelevant to climate change itself, so that when climate change comes around as part of the education and the implications of it being about doom, young people have a lot of skills already in place to stay engaged in the face of that kind of news.
Thank you for that. I think this question is another from a student who perhaps is in my colleague, Dr. Greg Gordon's class. They just finished reading your book. It's a class on environmental activism. I think this is a student from that class. Hannah Gangwish asks, in your book, you talk about having compassion to find common ground with others. How would you recommend introducing climate-related topics while also making it clear that you're willing to listen to others' values and opinions? A lot of our students are going to be going home to Thanksgiving soon. We live in a part of the country that is politically diverse. And so, yes, in the context of Christmas and Thanksgiving dinner, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think in my book, I tell this story of a couple of years in a row, my students would come back from fall break and be really upset about these big rifts that just sparked off between them and Uncle Bob or whoever. And I remember at first thinking, oh, that's good. You're out there teaching them, but this was such hubris, so naive. And I came to realize after a few years of this happening every single time, I thought, what's going on here? Do I need to rethink this? Is this actually good for my students that they're having fights with their family when they go home for these breaks? And it's causing these big existential questions about, is this worth it? Do I belong in college? Is, the cost of this, right? This sort of double consciousness of being in college when it's maybe creating all kinds of critical thinking and ways of seeing the world and knowledge and information that is quite difficult and might actually cause conflict if brought up at their home environments and their home communities. And so I'm deeply empathetic, and I'm thinking very much about you in that one chapter about be less right and more in relation. And there's never one answer to this question. There's always some nuance and flexibility that needs to be you need to be adaptable. But I do think that in my life, the way I've approached it, I now teach it, which is different than the way I used to teach it, that the relationships are more important than being right. Okay, so that's another way of putting this chapter, right? That I used to think that I was teaching my students to be really right, and beat people at arguments with their righteousness. and the cost to relationships and the cost of their own well-being was high. And that was something I hadn't recognized until later. So the relationship building, the calling in versus calling out, the making sure the bridges are still there so conversation can continue to happen is super important. Catherine Hayhoe is really helpful on this. She talks about hearing what people are worried about, because climate is going to touch all of us. And the word climate doesn't even have to be brought up for you to have a very effective conversation about climate change. And what I mean by that is that if we listen to what people are worried about, all of a sudden we can imagine and be compassionate about, even if we don't agree with it or we see other explanations as more true, we can at least be compassionate. This is the way this person sees the world. This is what they've been taught to be afraid of. And let's start there, right? That's the curious, compassionate conversation assignment that I talk about in the book, right? Let's start with what they are afraid of and our compassion for that fear. And compassion turns out to be a very, very generative place for conversation, to build bridges across difference, to keep things going, to change minds. People are much more likely to change their mind, you included, if you feel that somebody who's listening to you has compassion for you and can imagine your position. The critical essence here is to keep that bridge being open, and not to think, oh, my job right now is to be right, to come out more right. And I think that that's a wisdom aspect of being a college-aged person going through these kinds of weird transformations that college exposes your home life and in this new light, oh, this is how my whole life I was raised, and these are all the ideologies that I have been swimming around and haven't been thinking about. And there's so much going on there. It's very emotionally intense. And so to really give yourself a break, that your job is not to come home and teach everybody like what you've been taught in your class. Your job is to come home and keep your relationships, in my opinion.
Philosophers are not good at that.
No.
It is not a strong suit for us. This is such an engaging conversation. I'm just, people can trail off as they need to, but there's still lots of interest here. My dissertation director, Jude Jones at Fordham University, who's a philosopher herself, asks in the Q&A, she says, many universities think of mental health issues as something experienced by individuals. But what we are seeing here is, I think, an indication that mental health is one expression of the relational life we live embedded in society and political and personal orders that are broken. There was an op-ed in the New York Times recently making this point. Do you have specific insights about how to reframe the concept of mental health at universities so as to deal with it at the level of some of the causes, like climate dread, not only the symptoms?
Yes, I love this question. This is kind of where I spend all my a lot of my mental time right now. So I really love this question. Yeah. So I'll never forget walking into my dean's office one time and asking for, just trying to figure out some advice about how to deal with the fact that this wave of students every semester was causing me to not have the resources. I was burning out under the therapy sessions that I was impromptu trying to figure out how to deal with. And I was dealing with all these students kind of on an individual basis because they were all very private about their emotional responses to the stuff. They'd come to me in office hours or in emails, and I was feeling protective of that privacy. And then I thought, I'm not a therapist. What am I doing? Am I causing more harm? The argument to center emotions in climate education, the number one pushback I hear from most educators is, I'm not a therapist and I don't want to do more harm. And this is triggering, right? This can be very triggering for many people. And I don't have training in that. And my dean told me, send them to CAPS, send them to counseling and psychology services. This is not your responsibility. And that was, of course, him trying to protect my well-being. But the notion that what students are learning in their classes is not going to have an emotional register for them, or that they are somehow going to be able to separate their mind, hand. So there's heart, hand, and head, right? We want their head in there, and maybe their hands, because they're going to build something or do something with their hands. So action's cool, and skills, hard skills. So hands and head are cool, but the heart, no, it's too messy. Send it to CAPS, right? And there's a lot of stigma in American culture, especially where toxic positivity reigns, that if you're having problems with something, that's something wrong with you. You're just maladjusted in some way, right? And so there's a real push, I think, there's always been a push in mental health circles, but there's real push, especially in things like the movement for Black lives and the climate justice movement, to say, hey, these political conditions are causing deaths. It's not just police brutality on the street. It's also living under chronic stress, intergenerational trauma, collective trauma, historic trauma that does this to our bodies and has us having much worse health outcomes in our lives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a real politicization of emotions that is very common in social movements, but that in the climate movement has not been very prominent, in large part, I would argue, because the climate movement has been predominantly white and fairly privileged. So this sort of conventions around centering the heart in that work is as political, as very public, is not very, the climate movement hasn't been very adept at that, despite the science that's out there on emotions.
Let's take one more. This is from a colleague who's an activist and climate activist here in Spokane, Kirsten Angel. She asks, this is about grief, and it seems like maybe an apt way of ending. She asks, have you heard about communal grief ritual? I found a great deal of relief from being with others, sharing my earth grief. Francis Weller talks about the importance of processing grief in communal settings. We can't do it alone. We need a container in order to be able to release. Grief ritual was likely part of our cultures at some point.
Yeah. If our culture doesn't have it, my culture, for example, does not have that. So, right, where it's absent culturally, it is very effective to think of it that way. And I think just recently I was reading some article about the fact that grief is the sort of new mode of life in this day, that even just the sort of coming to recognition that there's so much turbulence and instability for people who have benefited from stability, that itself is a kind of a grieving process too. And whether or not you actually are familiar with or know intimately a species or a community or an ecosystem that is dying or dead, that grief is still a very alive emotion for a lot of people. And then there's also folks that are pushing back on the model of grief to say this is sort of inevitability, and a sort of a move towards inevitability that sort of focuses on what's gone, not what's still here that we can fight to save, right? So there's those many conversations happening around grief, but yes, around collectivity, which I think is your main point. And I'm thinking here in particular about folks like Laura Schmidt and Amy Lewis Rowe, who have created out of thinking about all of the scholars and psychologists, Kubler-Ross, et cetera, on grief, the Good Grief Network, which is a international now network of people who are trained and helping people through like I think it's 8 classes or 10 classes online of collective grieving. And death cafes have come up around climate and environmental issues, in addition to the climate cafe model. So processing any of the emotional qualities of how anybody feels about climate change is something that climate cafes also are trying to think about doing in a collective way. But your point about collectivity is spot on. The fetish of the individual in American culture is one of the biggest reasons why so many people feel pseudo-inefficacious or feel inefficacious. The sense that we are just individuals. And many other communities that see themselves as part of a collective, individualism has been a myth built up by privilege, right? So the less privilege you have, the less likely you are to think of yourself as just solely acting as an individual. And this is one of the reasons why there's so many really good critiques about the kind of colonialism inherent in climate injustice and that sort of thing. But individualism is really not effective for climate action on many, many fronts, much less grieving rituals or grieving processes. Yeah.
Reminds me of Bill McKibben's quote, people ask me what I can do as an individual to address the climate crisis. And I say, just stop considering yourself so much as an individual. And so it's a nice part of that. Well, I'd like to invite everybody at home and across the world to join me in thanking you for a really stimulating conversation. One of the dissatisfying parts about this is not hearing raucous applause and thanks for sharing your wisdom and gleaned experiences. This is really needed and valuable. And obviously the huge numbers of participants is indication of how much this is needed and desired. The talk tonight was recorded and will be available for viewing later for folks who want to play it. And also don't forget that Dr. Ray's book is available and is quite accessible for just about any audience. And so do take a look at it. And I think this talk and compared with the book would be a nice kind of combination. You'll get your slides and then get the book and you can just sort of have you walk them through it a little bit. So thank you. I wanted to remind everybody that we have another talk coming up in 2 weeks on climate modeling. And so that will be available. I hope that you've considered joining our email list because that's a good way of finding out about future events. We exist in part to help our communities understand and respond and find forms of meaningful agency, as Dr. Ray has talked about tonight. And so please join us in finding opportunities to do that, whether you're in Spokane or in your community. That is, finding paths to agency and action and meaningful collaboration with community members and the larger biotic community is a lot of what we're about. So thank you again, Dr. Ray, and good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Henning. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.